Most people think Apple was always destined to win. But there was a moment, not long ago, when this company was weeks away from collapse, and almost no one believed it would survive. A company that went from a tiny California garage to changing the entire computer industry, to standing on the edge of bankruptcy just a few decades later. Because today, it's almost impossible to imagine a world without Apple. The iPhone is everywhere. The glowing white logo became one of the most recognizable symbols on Earth. And Apple stores now look less like electronic shops and more like futuristic temples built out of glass and light. But long before all of that, Apple was a mess. Its products were failing. Its leadership was collapsing. Its competitors were crushing it. And by the 1990s, people inside Silicon Valley genuinely believed the company was finished. Not struggling, finished. The strange part is, Apple didn't collapse because it lacked brilliant ideas. In many ways, Apple was too far ahead of everyone else. It helped invent the modern personal computer. It helped change the way ordinary people interacted with technology. And for a brief moment in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it felt like Apple was becoming the future itself. At the center of all of this were two young outsiders. One was a quiet engineering genius who could build computers almost like magic. The other was intense, obsessive, difficult, charismatic, and completely convinced he was going to change the world. Together, they created a company inside a suburban garage and accidentally started a technological revolution. But revolutions have a habit of becoming empires, and empires have a habit of collapsing under their own ambition. Because as Apple grew larger, so did the egos. So did the tension. So did the chaos inside the company itself. And eventually, the very people who helped build Apple would begin tearing it apart from the inside. This is the rise, the fall, and unbelievable rebirth of Apple. I'm Ahmed, and this is the Money Archives. Before we dive in, if stories like this fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to the Money Archives. And let me know in the comments, what company's rise or collapse should we uncover next? Now, to understand how Apple conquered the world, we need to go back to California in the 1970s. Back when computers were enormous machines, hidden inside universities and government buildings. Back before ordinary people even thought about owning one. Back when two young men looked at those giant machines and imagined something everyone else thought sounded ridiculous. A computer for normal people. In the 1970s, the idea of having a computer inside your home sounded almost absurd. Computers were gigantic, expensive machines hidden away inside universities, corporations, and government laboratories. They hummed behind locked doors, surrounded by experts in white shirts and thick glasses, who spoke in code most ordinary people could barely understand. To the average person, computers were not personal objects. They were industrial machines, cold, complicated, untouchable. But inside California's growing world of engineers and hobbyists, something strange was beginning to happen. Groups of young programmers and electronics enthusiasts started gathering in garages, classrooms, and community clubs to experiment with smaller computer systems. This was the early heartbeat of Silicon Valley, before it became the polished tech empire we know today. Back then, it was less billion-dollar corporations and more long-haired young men carrying wires and circuit boards in cardboard boxes. One of those young men was Steve Wozniak. Quiet, shy, and almost unbelievably gifted with electronics, Wozniak could design computers with an elegance that other engineers admired immediately. He loved building things simply because he thought it was fun, not because he wanted power, not because he wanted fame. He was the kind of person who could spend hours obsessing over reducing a handful of computer chips just because it felt satisfying. Then there was Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs was different. Where Wozniak was soft-spoken and technical, Jobs was intense, persuasive, and completely obsessed with the idea of changing the future. He wasn't the greatest engineer in the room, but he understood something equally important: people. He understood excitement, presentation, emotion, vision. Jobs looked at computers and saw something bigger than machines. He saw culture. The two had met years earlier through mutual friends, bonding over electronics, pranks, and a shared love of pushing boundaries. Together, they made an oddly perfect team. Wozniak could build almost anything. Jobs could convince people it mattered. And in 1976, inside the garage of Jobs' parents' home in Los Altos, California, the two officially founded Apple Computer. The garage startup story has become so legendary now that it almost feels mythical. But at the time, there was nothing glamorous about it. They were assembling computer boards by hand, scrambling for parts, and trying to convince local computer stores to take a chance on them. Their first product, the Apple I, was primitive by modern standards. It looked more like a science project than a revolution. Buyers still needed to attach their own keyboard and monitor. But unlike many hobbyist kits of the era, it actually worked remarkably well. And more importantly, people noticed. Especially because Wozniak's design was genuinely ahead of its time. Soon, Apple moved beyond the garage stage and began building something far more ambitious, the Apple II. And this was the moment everything changed. Unlike earlier computer systems that looked intimidating and unfinished, the Apple II looked approachable. It arrived in a sleek plastic case instead of a pile of exposed parts. It displayed color graphics. Ordinary families could actually imagine placing one inside their homes. For the first time, personal computers started feeling personal, and demand exploded. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Apple was growing at a speed that felt almost unreal. Sales surged into the millions. Investors rushed in. Employees who had once been soldering parts together in cramped rooms suddenly became wealthy almost overnight. Steve Jobs was still in his 20s, and already people were beginning to view him less like a young entrepreneur and more like a celebrity. Apple wasn't just selling computers anymore, it was selling the future. Schools bought Apple computers, businesses bought Apple computers, families brought them into their living rooms and spare bedrooms. And as the personal computer revolution accelerated, Apple became one of its most recognizable faces. But Steve Jobs wasn't satisfied, not even close. Because while the Apple II was successful, Jobs believed computers still felt too technical, too intimidating, too cold. He wanted machines that normal people could use instinctively, machines that felt elegant, friendly, almost human. That obsession eventually led to the Macintosh. And when Apple introduced the Macintosh in 1984, it didn't feel like a normal product launch. It felt like a cultural event. Especially after Apple aired what would become one of the most famous commercials in advertising history, the 1984 ad. Dark hallways, rows of emotionless people staring at giant screens. A woman sprinting forward with a hammer before smashing the image of authoritarian conformity apart. Apple wasn't presenting itself as another computer company. It was presenting itself as a rebellion. The Macintosh introduced graphical icons, windows, and a mouse-driven interface that felt shockingly futuristic compared to the command line systems most people were used to. It helped make computers feel accessible in a way they never had before. And suddenly, Apple became cool. Not merely successful, cool. Artists loved Apple. Students loved Apple. Creative people loved Apple. Owning a Macintosh started feeling like a statement about who you were. But behind the scenes, Apple was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, because Steve Jobs' brilliance came with another side. He could be demanding, explosive, obsessive. Employees described impossible standards, emotional outbursts, and constant pressure. Jobs wanted perfection from everyone around him, and as Apple grew larger, those tensions only became worse. Meetings became battles, departments clashed internally, executives struggled to control him. And inside Apple's boardrooms, a dangerous question slowly began forming. Was Steve Jobs still the right person to lead the company he created? At first, those tensions stayed hidden beneath Apple's success, but eventually they exploded. And then, the company Steve Jobs created forced him out. After Steve Jobs was pushed out of Apple, the company entered a strange new era. On paper, things still looked stable. The Macintosh remained popular with artists, designers, and schools. Apple still had loyal customers. The logo still meant something. But underneath the surface, the company was beginning to drift. Part of the problem was leadership. Jobs and John Sculley had clashed constantly near the end of Jobs' time at Apple. Sculley preferred structure, predictability, and corporate discipline. Jobs wanted bold risks, radical products, and relentless innovation. After Jobs was gone, Apple became far more corporate, but also far less focused. And while Apple tried to figure out what it wanted to become, another company was rapidly taking over the world: Microsoft. Because during the late 1980s and early 1990s, Microsoft understood something incredibly important about the future of computing. Most people didn't care who made the computer. They cared that it was affordable. And Microsoft's Windows operating system spread everywhere because dozens of different companies could build cheap PCs that all ran the same software. Suddenly, families could walk into electronics stores and choose between endless rows of Windows machines at prices far lower than Apple computers. Once businesses standardized around Windows, momentum took over. Developers prioritized building for it, workplaces widely adopted it, schools began teaching it, and households followed suit, bringing Windows into everyday use. By the early 1990s, the beige Windows PC had quietly become the default computer of modern life. And Apple slowly started shrinking. This was especially painful because many people inside Apple believed Microsoft had borrowed heavily from ideas Apple helped popularize through the Macintosh. The graphical interface, the mouse, friendly icons, and windows. Apple had helped make computers feel human, but Microsoft scaled those ideas better, cheaper, faster, and Apple couldn't keep up. At the same time, Apple itself was becoming increasingly difficult to understand. The company began releasing an overwhelming number of products with confusing names and unclear differences. Stores filled with Performers, Quadras, PowerMacs, LC models, Centris systems, and countless variations that even tech enthusiasts struggled to keep track of. It no longer felt like Apple had a clear vision. It felt like they were improvising. The company that once simplified technology was now making it more confusing. And then came products like the Newton. On paper, the Newton sounded futuristic, a handheld digital assistant capable of organizing your life and recognizing handwriting. Today, it almost sounds like an early smartphone. But in the 1990s, the technology simply wasn't ready. Its handwriting recognition quickly gained a reputation for errors, becoming a punchline in TV shows and a target for comic strips. Instead of looking revolutionary, Apple looked lost. And this started becoming the pattern. Leadership kept turning over, strategies never settled, internal conflicts grew, and products were released without a clear sense of purpose. Apple no longer felt like the company inventing the future. It felt like a company trying desperately to survive the present. And Wall Street could see it happening in real time. Sales weakened, market share collapsed. Losses mounted into the hundreds of millions. By the mid-1990s, analysts openly questioned whether Apple would survive at all. Technology magazines ran stories predicting the company's death. Investors fled. Employees lost confidence. At one point, Apple reportedly had only months of cash left before the situation became catastrophic. Meanwhile, Microsoft kept growing stronger. Bill Gates had become the dominant figure in the technology industry, while Apple increasingly looked like a fading relic from an earlier computer era. Then came the moment that felt almost impossible to believe. In 1997, one of the craziest things happened. Microsoft invested $150 million into Apple. To outsiders, the symbolism was brutal. The rebellious company that once portrayed itself as the creative alternative to Microsoft now needed help from its greatest rival just to stay alive. And when Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen during Apple's Macworld announcement, sections of the audience actually booed. Because in that moment, Apple didn't look powerful, it looked defeated. The company that once promised to change the world now seemed completely directionless. And for a while, it genuinely felt like the story was ending. But behind closed doors, Apple was becoming desperate enough to consider something unthinkable. And then, Apple called the one person they once pushed away. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was exhausted. Not just financially, but internally. It had become bloated and unfocused. Too many products, too many opinions, and no clear direction. Jobs saw it immediately. The issue wasn't talent, it was clarity. So he didn't start by building something new. He simplified, aggressively. Projects were cut, product lines reduced, and meetings became blunt and decisive. At one point, he walked into a room and asked a simple question. What are the 4 products we should actually be making? That question reshaped Apple. For years, the company had tried to be everything. Now it would focus. Fewer products, clear identity, thoughtful design, and something most tech companies overlook: emotion. Because people don't fall in love with specs, they fall in love with how something feels. That idea came to life in the Think Different campaign. Instead of highlighting features, it celebrated icons like Albert Einstein, Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Lennon. Apple wasn't just selling computers anymore, it was rebuilding its identity, and people noticed. Then came the iMac. It looked nothing like anything else. Colorful, rounded, almost playful in a world of dull beige boxes. Critics laughed. Customers loved it. The iMac didn't just sell, it proved people still wanted Apple to win. They just needed a reason. Momentum followed. Then came the iPod. Digital music players already existed, but they were clunky. Apple made it simple. A clean design, a scroll wheel, 1,000 songs in your pocket. That was it. And suddenly, the iPod was everywhere. Airplanes, schools, subways. Those white earbuds became a symbol. But the real breakthrough was the ecosystem. With iTunes, Apple connected everything – music, software, and hardware – into one smooth experience. That shift turned Apple into more than a computer company. It became a lifestyle brand. Then came 2007. Jobs walked on stage with a simple black device. No keyboard, just glass. The iPhone. Smartphones existed before, but they were complicated and uninspiring. The iPhone made them intuitive. It made the internet portable, apps natural, technology personal, and everything changed. Cameras, maps, communication, shopping, entertainment. Entire industries reshaped around it. The company, once on the brink of collapse, became one of the most powerful in the world. Stores spread globally. Launches became events. People lined up for hours. And the turnaround came down to one thing. Apple rediscovered what it had lost: focus, identity, vision. And with it, it reshaped modern life. Apple's story isn't about computers or phones, it's about identity. At its best, Apple didn't follow demand, it created it. It built things people didn't know they wanted yet. That's what made it different. But in the 1990s, it lost that. The vision faded, the products scattered, and the company nearly collapsed. The comeback wasn't about better tech, it was about clarity, focus, simplicity, and purpose. By all logic, Apple should have failed. Microsoft had already won. The future seemed set. And yet, Apple came back and reshaped modern life. If it had disappeared, the world would look very different today. I'm Ahmed, and this is the Money Archives. What should we break down next?